All righty. Welcome back, everybody. This week on Untangled, we are joined by Trevor Calabro. Calabro?
Yeah, that's right.
Calabro. Thank you. An industry veteran whose 2 decade career spans some of the most complex and impactful corners of user experience research. Throughout his journey, Trevor has remained committed to elevating user needs through both qualitative and quantitative methods, from usability testing to advanced statistical analysis. Whether working in finance, tech, or design, his approach has always centered on surfacing insight, challenging assumptions, and helping organizations build with empathy and clarity. Trevor, I'm so excited finally to be talking to you. How are you today?
Good, thanks, and I appreciate you having me. I look forward to this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I got all excited. I was kind of down, and then I was like, I get to interview Trevor. So then it made my day shiny again. Thank you. All right. So, Trevor, I was telling you a little bit about the audience. I have a mixture of people who are starting out, people who are thinking about what to do next in their careers. So, let's just start with the basics. Can you share how you got into UX?
Yeah, so you said in the intro that it's been almost 2 decades. So it's crazy to think I'm in year 20 right now. So it was a long time ago. So things are different, right? But I can tell you. So don't take my story as a way forward or a path into the profession or anything like that. This is just how I did it. And by the way, in my experience, most UX professionals have some weird sorted path into the industry anyway. So here's my weird and sorted path: is right out of college. I went to college for graphic design, and I fancied myself. I was going to go work in New York City at some of the big design firms that do logos like Massimo Vignelli or whatever. And it was a very tough time for those kind of jobs. They didn't exist. So the very first job I got was at a large multi-billion-dollar telecoms company in the marketing department. And this was before, it was on the East Coast, and really before, this was in, I don't, you'd have to look at my LinkedIn, but it was like in the 2000s area, right? Like 2005, 2006. So it was right before on the East Coast the job title of UX was started to, permeate throughout the kind of the world. It had started over on the West Coast and it was coming over our way. So my job title was not, it was not, had nothing to do with UX, but my job was to make touchscreen kiosks for these big trade shows with or marketing thing. And this dates me a lot, but it was done in Flash. So when I say built, I mean I designed, built, in Flash ActionScript 2.0. So it was not. It was before it was even object oriented, right? That shows you what kind of technology we're talking about. And what happened there was I didn't know anything about user research. I thought of it like graphic design, but I was making interfaces and I was making touchscreen stuff, and it was really really interesting. And I started to learn more and more about how to design interfaces. And what happened was they started to send me to the trade shows and say, "Why don't you watch some people use these things?" And there was my intro to UX research, and I absolutely fell in love with that part. So I was that person with a clipboard saying, "Hey, do you mind if I watch you use this?" And I would ask questions. I didn't even realize I was doing, like what we would now call kind of like guerrilla style usability testing or concept testing, or these types of activities, like real world contextual like inquiry type stuff. And it was just fascinating, and I loved that part. I fell in love then and there when I started to do that with the act of seeing the messiness of humans interacting with technology.
Trevor,
Well,
do you have any indication why did they send you to the trade shows? Like, did they anticipate that there was a problem? Was there something happening? Why did they even send you?
yeah, so these kiosks were essentially product walkthroughs. So whenever the salespeople were not available, you could come over and just get product walkthroughs. And they got a bunch of feedback that, like, we wish we knew this, we wish we knew that, this didn't work, this broke. So yeah, it was due to user feedback to the salespeople that they're like, why don't we bring? They no longer could answer the questions anymore, and they can no longer come to me and say, hey, why don't you change this? Why don't you change that? So this was, after a few real world tests and iteration, real world iteration, that they were like, maybe you should just come and see for yourself because these changes aren't helping, because it was coming through the lens of them and they weren't thinking from the user's perspective. So, and that's in my mind, that's when I became a researcher. Um, that was I was there for I forget exactly. It was a while, 3 or 4 years, and then I was poached by a company called Minitab, and Minitab makes one. It makes many products, but its flagship product is also called Minitab, and Minitab is the world's foremost desktop statistical software package, and that's where I learned the rigor of statistics. And I was there for almost 9 years, and I absolutely loved that position. It's where I had a huge team there. There were 12 UXers for primarily one or two products, and it was we were based in the R&D department, so we were allowed to do a lot of exploratory work, a lot of as well as validation testing. But we got to explore a wide range of different ways to do, hardcore, complicated statistics the computer. And I absolutely love that job. It's where I cut my teeth. It's where I went from, I was, I was just called a designer at when I did the kiosks. Then I was designer slash researcher. And by the time my 9 years was up, I was full research. I did nothing but research. And that was probably the last, I don't know, 5 years that I was there. And I absolutely loved it. It's where I really learned again, I learned the qual side kind of ad hoc on my own. And then I learned the quant side in what I call like the school of hard knocks. It was like the X-Men school for statistics, where I was surrounded by PhD statisticians. And some of the people on my team were very heavy quant. So I got thrown into the deep end of quant, and I learned the power of quant. So I always describe myself as I naturally lean towards qual, but I learned quant in this amazing way. And it's really formed how I describe myself today, which is a true mixed methods researcher. And then from there, that's where I really cut my teeth. Ever since I built a system and a framework for quantifying and qualifying, pretty much an ops related thing at Minitab. And then I got poached again to do that at large organizations. And I've been kind of rinsing and repeating that ever since. So I've worked for anything from multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerates to build their kind of internal research ops discipline, as well as pre-profit startups and everything in between. And there, I get to leverage all those things all together. So I always fancy myself as like a high-level IC that can bring those type of system thinking and real-world application. So, I don't have a PhD. I didn't go to a fancy school, but I learned all these things on the job, and my whole kind of success in the industry has been forming these things in the real world based on what really happens in business, and attaching real user outcomes from research in the real world to business outcomes in that kind of Venn diagram.
So you said something I thought was interesting, and I know there are all kind of debates on this all the time. So let's talk about what you call the power of quant. What is that? What is the value of quant in UX research?
Yeah, so like Jacob Nielsen recently came out and said something like, I'm going to butcher this, so don't quote me, but it's something like just a way of thinking that he thinks a good UX practice should include something like 70% qual and 30% quant. And I feel
Mm,
like that mix is probably about right. I do agree with that. Like qual, you should probably be doing more qual than quant. But I do think that we should be spending more time on quant and understanding that. Like if you can just understand how to clean data better, like larger data sets, and then understand how to analyze data in different ways. And this is all stuff I learned on the job at Minitab, right? I didn't know this going into it. Then it can be very powerful. So I think what you're alluding to is I hear the same things, and people give quant a bad name, but I believe they're thinking of it as like I ran a survey monkey survey, and then I got graphs out the other side, and all
hmm
I need to understand is simply, is my sample size big enough or not, and
Right.
that's it. And that's how they think of it. And they're like, well, like why did any of this happen? This just shows the movie Anchorman.
Yeah.
Steve Carell's character Brick. He just looks around the room and says, "I love lamp. I love curtains." Quant without qual gets a bad name, and I think it's because it's an I love lamp metric. It's just like you just walk in the room and you say what you see, and then you walk
Yeah.
away. So I
Yeah.
totally understand where that sentiment comes from. But yeah, the power of quant, the power of being able to measure things, is to get predictions, to understand patterns, to understand, to get signal on things, and to really understand what's happening. So in the world of generative research, you're going to want to do some qual and then follow it up with quant. And it's reverse when you're doing evaluative. You want to do some quant into your qual, right? You look at your usage analytics to see what you want to see what's happening, and then figure out why.
I'm going to clip that part because that is the debate that I have with people all the time. Which
Yeah.
comes first? And I like to say you do qual when you don't know what the answers are going to be, right? Like we have no idea. And then once you have a feel for what the answers might be and why, then you use quant to understand like the spread. How often, right? How common? How do I measure these things? I know people are gonna drop all kind of things in the comments. I said what I said, but okay. So I'm gonna
I
tell
get it
you what
though.
to say that.
Quant is meaningless without qual. This is why I consider myself mixed methods. I think
Yeah,
I've seen more bad decisions made off of quant only analysis than off of mixed methods, or maybe not necessarily mixed methods, but at least parallel triangulation with
yeah.
qualitative data. So I totally agree with you. I think that's a good way. And what I said is almost always true. It's not, I get
Yeah,
called out too all the time when I say something like it's not a truism. It's just almost always true. Like the Jacob Nielsen
almost
70
always.
30 thing. It's not 100% true, but it's almost always true.
Yeah. How do we make quant less scary for qual researchers?
I mean, I'll take this opportunity to give myself a little plug. I have a series on I write a blog called UX Research in the Wild. And on my blog, I have a series where I break down. So Minitab is an extremely expensive piece of software. And when I stopped working there, I still wanted to do the analytics. So I taught myself R. R is free. So many people find R there's a barrier to R. But the fact that it's free and open source is beautiful, and it's not that hard to learn. So I put together something like 12 tutorials. And if you step through real world tutorials, if you step through those in sequence that I've got on my blog, by the end, you'll be able to do most things that you would need. Like these people consider them advanced ways to analyze quant data. So I recommend everyone checking that out. It's called the R series. So the R series on my blog is pretty straightforward. I also have little articles about you know confidence intervals. So there's ways to start small, and I believe that. I mean, you could ask an LLM, or go to ChatGPT and say, I'm a UX researcher. I'm slotted in qualitative research, and I want to understand quant better. What's the first thing I can do? You can even put your data set in, and it'll kind of tell you what to do. These are ways I'm using LLMs now to help. But some basic things you can do is just get basic statistics. So if you Google get basic statistics, it'll tell you, mean, median. It's like in Excel right now, there's like a button. If you just press the basic statistics button, it'll just give you a readout of it and understand those, understand what those are, go through each one of those one at a time. And that's a really great entry point to then further go into stuff like I talked about with R. So it depends on where you're at. If I'm qual only and I haven't even thought of quant ever, then start with the basic statistics that you could find out of any Google search or right out of the button in your Excel file, or just ask an LLM. I love the fact that that's an answer to questions now. Just ask an LLM; it'll give you great answers. It's one thing they do great. The debate is like, where's the human in the loop required? That's not one of them. Asking a question like that, it will give you exactly what you need. And then second step is once you feel that you're confident there, or if you feel you're there today, just go through the R series, and it will really kind of break down how you can do these things in the real world. Because it seems daunting. This is what I meant when I said out of that 30%, I think we should spend a little more time with our data. This is
Mm-hmm.
this is exactly what I'm talking about. And I could talk about it ad nauseum, but I found the best way to make a difference is to just go and do it. That's why my tutorials are like real world. They use actual data sets, and they're little stories wrapped around. So
And that's important. That was going to be my next question. Do you have data that they can use to play with and actually kick the tires and learn it? Learn it.
yep, I make it so simple. All 12 tutorials assume that you've never opened R, downloaded R, or even seen data before. So it starts, the very first thing is like download this data set. So it has sample data sets right in each one of the tutorials, and step by step, all the way from downloading the app and to working through all the different things step by step.
So, thinking about your career, what are some of the things that you wished you had learned sooner? Like, if you're like, if I could go back and tell my earlier self this, what would those things be?
Yeah. So I had a big turning point somewhere in that 9 years at Minitab. So I was learning on the job, but I think many people do this. I kind of lack some of the UX foundational stuff. And I mean UX as a profession, not just research, right? So many people, when I hear them, many researchers, when they're asked this question on podcasts like this, the answer is something around, like how to execute a proper max diff, like something very much in the minutia. I I believe anyone can learn any of that stuff as you go on the job in the real world. And the best way to learn is by doing it, right? Not by reading a blog, not by, unless it's a tutorial or something, but not by just like thinking about it in theory. In my experience, I've learned by doing, and I think there's massive data that supports that in all of education. So what I missed were the high level, I had big gaps. So in my particular job at that moment, at that time, I had two jobs. And we really focused heavily on certain things because that made sense for my department, for the products I was working with, the product teams, the stakeholders. And but I missed many gaps. And what happened was I went to some old school NNG conferences. This was pre-COVID when you had to go in person. And learning those retroactively learning kind of all the foundational stuff, it kind of upskilled my entire UX practice like 100-fold. That's when I went from I would have called myself a very competent UX researcher to when I got that's when I started to think in the way of systems. And this is where I started to piece pieces together, understand the value of a gap analysis and why that's necessary, understand why you need to do I've come to the conclusion that almost all good UX research starts with a top task analysis, right? And those types of high level framework related truisms were just because I didn't do them every day, they were a gap. It was a gap in my own knowledge. So by filling in those things, even if I rarely use them in my day to day, it gave me the larger picture. It helped me think like a systems thinker, and it put all this stuff together. And in my last few years, I've been focusing a lot on now taking that and then converting it into ROI and speak the impact part, speaking the role of the business. I would have never been able to get as far as I have in the world of calculating the ROI of UX without first being able to put together that kind of cradle to grave, high level system of how researching users can go and all the different gaps that are in there. Have you ever seen that like Christian Rohr, where it's all the different? It's like here's the 80 most used or
Yeah.
research methods. That's awesome, but how many? Like read that list. How many do you do on a daily basis? I bet in very few people do all 80 things commonly, right? So all the things you don't do are the gaps. It's kind of a cool way to think of it.
I feel like, and I agree 100%. I feel like the need to move at the speed of business
Yep.
prevents that. So, what advice would you give to the people who are like, I don't have time to do anything else?
That's right. I did get lucky. I told you, when I was at Minitab, we had a very large UX discipline. It was very well respected and well funded. And they made a huge investment on sending all of us to multiple trainings, including a bunch of energy on sites,
Mm.
like 7-day on sites. This is how it used to be. Um, and it really did be having some, and it doesn't need to be energy. It can be any one of these frameworks, that makes sense. For me, it really opened up the world of what I was missing. Um, I think this can be done systematically. So I was able to batch it all in like a couple 7-day, week long
Mm.
conferences, and that was awesome. Um, Stressful, but awesome. I'll tell you, by day 7, when you're taking all those exams and you're doing a class a day and your brain's like melted, it's not, it's intense. It's hard to retain. But there's another way to do it, which is systematically, which is strategically. And I've helped. The reason I know this is I'm at a point in my career where people reach out to me like, "Hey, could you help me do X? Could you help me do Y?" So I think if you dedicate an hour a day, maybe an hour once, 3 days a week or something like that, some kind of schedule that you can put together in which you identify those gaps and try to learn about it, I think it would upskill anyone's knowledge in the professional lot. I do think once you fill in those gaps, and it's an iterative thing, you have to continually like look into this, But once you get the big broad strokes, I think everything else kind of falls into place. So I would recommend setting aside specific time on your own to do this if your organization isn't going to fund it or isn't going to champion it. And I know that's difficult. We all have lives. We all have other stuff to do besides work. I do think it's worthwhile, though. I think a little bit of continuing education, and I would go to the tried and true sources. What I would not do is go on Medium, type in the topic du jour, and read whatever pops up.
Yeah.
I would go to places. There's a lot of misinformation out there, so I would go to the places that are reliable because it could actually do more harm than good to learn the wrong lessons from the wrong people at the wrong time.
Right. And then going back to, kind of that on the job training. So being able to take the things that you're working on, right now, so that it's applicable, and then applying like that level of knowledge or practice to
Yeah.
it would be very helpful.
Yeah, that's a
Okay.
good point. I'll just piggyback on that. I should have said that. And then if you can convince, I've never had a boss say, "Hey, would you mind if I spend a little extra time to do this thing I've been working on, and maybe it'll help us do X in the future," right?
Mhm.
Like, and be willing to work, a little overtime or whatever that means in most cases to try to implement one of these things as a case study. And if you have explicit buy-in from your team, which I've never asked something like that in which it was turned down. Like, because
Mhm.
I mean, it's a proposition that would be crazy to turn down. Wait, you're going to spend your own time to implement something here that's going to help everybody? That sounds great, But to explicitly have that conversation, to do the thing as an experiment, frame it as an experiment, and then see. I always think of it like, if you are super targeted and you hit an exact thing at the exact right place and can show success, then it can, like concentric circles, grow outwardly. And then you can take something little that you add and it can become a big thing. All the way to these systems that I'm talking about. That's every system I've implemented in an org, including multi-billion dollar tech conglomerates, starts with just one little thing. You know, I ran one little test to validate that the buttons in the vertical primary navigation needed to have labels, right?
Yeah.
And then from there, just, oh, how'd you figure that out? Oh, like this. And then, oh, what can that span to other UI elements? Oh, you've done a heuristic review for this. Maybe we could systematize that. Maybe other people can do that. And then, you're off to the races.
I think that's super valuable because a lot of researchers, designers too, are always trying to get impact, big impact. But sometimes you can't do it all in one project, right? Sometimes you kind of have to like practice, try something, introduce something, be successful at it, and then they'll trust you to start doing more.
Yes.
It sounds
And
like.
by the way, so like I said, about the last 5 years, I've been really focused on the ROI of UX. Um, Nothing can harm that initiative more than when you overestimate, over extrapolate, and I've seen so many slide decks where, because the truth is, I mean, you've heard the data, right? It's something like the Forrester report, right? Way back in the day, it was like, for every dollar, it's like $200 in savings for every dollar spent on UX or something like that. That was extrapolated from some Apple study. I'm making up the details, but it's something like
Yes.
that. That's great, but I've never seen it move the needle in the real world. I've never seen anyone read that Forrester study, like an executive, and be like, well, that means we should hire 200 more people because, like in the UX department, it never works in the real world. But if you can show small wins and speak back to the business in their own terms, meaning don't do the super over extrapolation. How many slide decks have you seen where, like, okay, we fixed this interface and we found that it takes users a minute less time on task. And then if you take that times the 500,000 active users a day that interact with that one workflow times X times this over 3 years, that project saved $3.5 billion. It's like, wait, what? And then we extrapolated it, and we looked at the average salary across the. So you're welcome. We moved that button, and now 3.3 $1.3 billion. It's like, no, the stakeholders read right through that. It makes no sense to them because they're like, maybe in theory, but like, what does this mean in the real world? So a
Yeah.
better way to say it was like, for the dollar spent, we save this, you know, in the future, like that kind of thing.
So you just said the trigger word, right? Like calculating ROI for UX. Talk about that. What is your recommendation? What do you tell people when they ask you that question? How do we do this?
I'm smiling because I hate to be like, just like, go to my blog, but I've had a few. I write an article a week, and they're fairly deep and intense UX research dork blogs. They average around 3,000 words, and they're crazy. And a couple of mine have gone like viral in the UX sphere, and one was my one on the ROI of UX. So I have a 5-step process that I've come up with. This is just based on the real world that many organizations have adopted. In fact, there's websites that now have calculators. They've built web calculators based on the five step framework. Um, but essentially, it's what you would think. It's just like, identify the purpose. It's, you know what it is. It's treat your UX work like a UXer, right? So you need
Hmm.
to know the requirements. I mean, it's just kind of basic. It's something that slips our mind all the time. Like we can figure out what's possible from the way we do like the way we work on product teams, right? So you figure out what you're trying to learn. You figure out what uh, uh, units of measurement you have access to. And then I talked about gap analysis. You can do a mini gap analysis. You got to find the ones that map to one another. Where does the needs meet what we have access to calculate, to understand? This is, are you doing ROI? Is it like how much money are we predicted to make? Or is it how much money we will save? Is it like, usually it goes back to money. Even at nonprofits, it usually goes back to money. So I always tell people, if your organization is opposed to money, you can use a different final kind of unit of measurement, but most places care about money. So you might want to just have that in your back pocket. And then you do another gap analysis. So like step 3 would be to figure out what the stakeholders care about. So what are we trying to learn? What access data do we have access to, and how does that map to how stakeholders currently think? So you want to meet them where they're at, and then from there you do a standard calculation. There you just write the math out,
Yeah.
and then reporting is step 5, the reporting, which I always advocate something like what I said: for X amount of dollars you save this spent, you save this amount of money. And I have a couple rules of thumb with those calculations, which is you want to always estimate, like round down. So this is everything to avoid that $3.4 billion
Yeah.
savings, like crazy extrapolation. And show your work. Never say anything in definitives, and make it very clear that these are estimates. My favorite thing to put on a slide deck is the approximate symbol, right? Because that inherently tells you this is not clear data. This is not like actuals. These are predictions. So just be clear about what you're doing. I see so many people hesitant to do so because they want to, like, we're as valid as the accounting department. It's like, well, the accountants are doing predictions too. In accounting, I hear this argument sometimes. UX UX happens only after a user interacts with something.
Hmm.
That's the definition. It's in the name, user experience. Therefore, anything that happens prior to a real user using it in the real world is not UX. That's something else. And I think that's hogwash. That makes no sense. That's like saying like the technical definition of accounting is to take to account for money spent. Oh, accountants do so much more than that. Like the job title itself doesn't define your role, right?
Right.
It is what's expected, what's best for the business, and it should be contextual. Every business is different. There's no template, so you need to you get from 0 to 60 with templates, and then if you want to really succeed, there's a piece of advice for the career, right? If you want to really succeed and upgrade your skill set, the way to go from junior to senior is simply get out of the templatization of the world and do custom things for your custom organizations.
I see that all the time. That was a conversation I was having. I think people block themselves in using templates, right? And then they need permission to come out of that template zone. It's like, who are you waiting for? Who is supposed to give you the permission? If it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit, right?
I want to be real clear. Templates are great, and I
Yeah.
provide tons of templates because it gets people started. But I
Yeah.
always think of them as a starting point, and
Yeah.
I put a caveat in every template I've ever used. Like, feel free to change where this doesn't work for you.
Yeah.
You know,
Because if it doesn't fit, right? If you're not telling the whole story because it doesn't fit into this template, that is your permission now to try something
yeah. I
different.
mean, I've worked in an organization that was just like opposed to spreadsheets. I don't know why. They just didn't like Excel and they didn't like Google Sheets, right? So we just did who that's fine. I don't There's nothing wrong with that. I've worked with some people that are so strict and stringent. They're like, "Well, why not?" And they want to argue that. It's like, "Well, no, meet the business where it is." This is where UX
Yeah.
and especially UX research may get a bad name. The people that transition out of academia sometimes get the bad rap of being too rigid, and these are
Yeah.
part of the reasons why, right? In business,
Yeah.
we don't necessarily need the rigor of academia statistically. Neither do we with our methods. Our methods are meant to be fluid. So I love the idea of, especially if you're just getting started, find a template that works for you in your context, and then that's a great starting point. The problem is many people just find the template and that's it. I did it. Job well
Yeah.
done.
Yeah. And didn't really think through it.
Yeah.
I do have a question on that note because talking about this idea of like people who are coming out of academia, the first time I break their heart is when I tell them all that stuff you put in the front about your methodology, move it to the back. Put it in the appendix,
Oh
business
yeah,
doesn't care.
reporting, you mean? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, put it in the back.
yeah.
So what
Yeah,
do
it's
you
like,
have a
hey,
framework for
no
how to
one
report?
cares. You're like, hate to break it
Yeah,
to
no,
you, no one
they
cares.
don't care. The only people who are going to care are going to be researchers,
Other
and we know to
researchers.
go to the
Yeah.
back, right?
I just had that conversation earlier today at work.
We're the only ones who are going to go look.
Yep.
Okay, so do you have a framework for reporting? Like if you were to give somebody advice on how to report to the business, what would you tell them?
Yeah. So again, I think about templates, but I always like to think I reverse engineer all this stuff. I even reverse engineer. Remember the systems I talked about? The way I talked about in the very beginning, it sounds rigid, but it's very fluid. I reverse engineer from what the outcome needs to be or is expected to be, right?
Yeah,
And that's done by like good stakeholder communication and like upfront stakeholder kind of management. So when I reverse engineer these things, that's what tells me what the best report style is. There are some good rules of thumb though. Like I always put very explicit. I'm all about being explicit. I write it out in like very very plain English that anyone can understand what it was. I call it UX research or user research. I write those words at the top of the page all the time. Then I almost always have like a little gray box area that just says sources. So I always link to the source. This is for many reasons. This is the or not debate, conversation I just had. No one ever cares about the raw data until they disagree with the recommendations or disagree with the outcome.
yeah.
Then and we've all been there, where people now all of a sudden your methodology is under the microscope. First of all, always be transparent. This is why I talked about approximate symbols, stuff like that. Always be transparent. Always use good ethics and good methodologies, right? And know your stuff, because if you don't, when someone does dig in, you will lose credibility. UX research at your organization will lose credibility, and it could affect UX at large within your organization. So it's very, very critical that even though it's very rare for someone to dig in and question your methodology, you must always act as if that was going to happen on every single project. So that's kind of a good rule of thumb. So always, always use that kind of rigor. I don't mean statistical rigor. I just mean rigor of, you know, document your hypothesis. I mean, even if it's not a real hypothesis, like scientifically, but document the intention. I always ask stakeholders, like, what are you trying to answer? They come to
Yeah.
you with like, I need you to run a survey. It's like, oh, what questions are you trying to answer? That's always a really good way to deflect and not just run the survey, right? Okay, so reverse engineer. So there's almost always a little thing at the top that says, here's how we got there, pretty much, and here's the links. What you're looking at is this kind of analysis that works on here. Sometimes I'll link to here's an academic article about why SuperQ is superior to MPS, something like that. Try to front load some of the questions you might get. Oh, I forgot the number one rule of thumb. Every report I act as if it's being read by someone just picked it up and they have no context. So the next thing underneath is there's a little blurb of what it is. What's the product? Why was it done? What questions were we supposed to answer? This is all done, like I said, in the very beginning, when your very first conversation. Hey researcher, run me a survey. Well, what are you trying to answer? The answer to that question gives you your blurb. This is a product that does this. You act as if anyone off the street picked up your document. And then I like to lead with
One
the
thing that
big the
I'll add
big
to that
things.
is the idea that we feel like when we do research that they're going to do it, use it, read it right now, right? And especially with things like layoffs, that person who is reading that report and acting on it may not have even worked there when you did that research. So you have to be super super clear.
Yeah, exactly. And then that's on the front. I think of the front page as executive summary, right? And then you put the big findings right there, boom, in your face. Here's what we found, just like you said. So kind of the above the fold is explaining what it is in very, very, very clearly and giving sort. Now, again, I also am. I optimize around very complex systems. So it may look different if what you're talking about, again, templates are only, so what I just described was a good template for when you're working on extremely complicated interfaces. If you're working on something more, B2C, not even e-commerce, just a simple, I don't even know what to call it, like an informational website or something like that, you might not have to do all that stuff in the beginning to set the stage. It may be inherent. So skip those things. I guess the rule of thumb would be skip those things if you can,
Mm-hmm.
as long as you assume that anyone could pick up the report, read the front page, and get a sense of what it was for, what it did, and the big takeaways. And then you dive in, and it's just a funnel. I just think of it as an information funnel. I think of it just like, you ever see the heat maps of a website where people usually by the end, it's like they're not scrolling, or they're not at the bottom, like a scroll map. It's like if you're reading, I try to get 80% of the questions answered by the business in the first page, and then you just, and then if that person wants even more power to them. Awesome, let's give them the next level of information that makes sense for that person. Then knock off, whatever that 12%, and then and then if you made it to the bottom, you've done it. Congratulations, you're a bona fide user researcher dork that wants to know every single thing about the study. You did it. Like, awesome. That's how I think of it.
One thing that you talk a lot about, and I would love for you to kind of share that with the audience, is the importance of documenting those assumptions. I think people just kind of skip that, and then they don't understand why their reports don't land, right? It's not an aha moment because they didn't even really get into that. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think you're probably referring to some of my articles. So I talk about this quite often. Is the and it doesn't need to be so formal. I think where people get tripped up, in my experience, when I talk with people, it's they think of it as very much like scientific rigor, like it must be a true hypothesis, and we're going to test the null hypothesis. And yes, these things are true, but does that land with your stakeholders? When I was at Minitab, it actually really did. That's how we spoke at that. That was the CEO was a PhD statistician who was like chair of the board of statistics at Stanford and Penn State, right? So it's like, okay, that makes sense. That's what resonates with her. But what resonates with your stakeholders? So again, you want to reverse engineer this, and the idea of assumptions, especially when it comes to methods. So one thing, again, back to academia versus industry, the most appropriate method many times is constrained by your timeline and your access to things. So I like to think of it as like there's some methods that are super fast, but it's a trade-off. And as long as you explain those trade-offs up front, that's what I mean by documenting any assumptions. So it's what are the trade-offs and make them super explicit. And I don't know if I'm explaining it very well, but I think that kind of rule of thumb has helped me a lot in all my reporting. I try to think about what the executives who are intended to read this, the questions they would ask, and I answer those questions up front.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like the conversational design, the old school conversational design methodology. So that here's a good stress test for it. You can write out just what your report is, just in the words, no graphs, no images, nothing like that. And you hand it to someone else. And you say, you're going to play the role of the report. And I'm going to play the role of the stakeholder. Or you get a third party to come in. And you are only allowed to answer my questions based on what's on that paper. And you just ask the paper questions. This is like an old school method for conversational content development. And it's actually really a great, quick and easy way to do it. I've done it with stakeholders. I've done that as stakeholder management type thing. Like, hey, here's the reports. This is the first time you've seen a report for this kind of method. Do you mind if we go over it? You could just async, send them the Word doc, and they could put comments in there based on nothing, right? Because they don't really know what they're even looking at yet, right? Yeah. Or you can do some kind of interactive thing like this if that's appropriate for your workplace. Like those little guerrilla style things, I think work wonders, especially in industry.
I like that. I'm definitely still that last one. Thinking about our profession, what are some things that you're excited about?
Oh man, that's a big one. Yeah, I don't buy the hype about AI ruining everything. In fact, I kind of see it the other way around. I see it as there's been an influx of people within the industry. And I believe at some point we were slightly oversaturated. There were more people than, and our organizations have told us so. You've seen it in layoffs. But what is happening is people that are good at using LLMs to do things that LLMs are good at, and not, like I call it the charlatan stuff, like writing the report for you in and of itself and finding the patterns and doing all the things that do not require human subjectivity. If you can get yourself out of that mind frame, the idea of proxy users is the most toxic and negative thing I've ever seen. This idea of AI users, we don't need to touch real people. We're just going to write in a super detailed persona and then ask the LLM what would happen in the beauty. I learned this when I did the kiosks 20 years ago, right? When I was doing the kiosk, I learned in why I fell in love with research over design was all the confounding variables of the real world and messy humans doing things. About 80% of what humans do, in my experience, are predictable and they match the body of research. But that 20% is gold. When I discover something that, oh, in this particular scenario, these particular users in this particular product do something totally counterintuitive, that is the aha moment. And that's the kind of thing that I think, although that's the true value that an advanced UX researcher can bring to an organization, that's where I believe we've got bogged down in all these menial tasks and
Hmm.
all these things that don't, like, pretty much concentrating on a lot of things that don't matter, and done research around labeling buttons at 7 organizations. I think my life's work can be boiled down to, like, I've convinced 7 organizations to label their icons by default. That's like it's just like, is there any more low hanging fruit? Right? It's just
Right.
like, this is
Right.
just, it's crazy. Anyway, everyone thinks their users are so unique, so we rerun the same study. If you want to study, I've got a great study design for that. I've run it 7+ times. Um, the value we get is not that. It's not rerunning the same study to validate 40 years worth of human computer interface data, all the secondary research. That's not the value. The value is discovering novel and new things. And and I believe that the advent of things like LLMs will be able to let experienced user researchers really thrive in the fact that what we can do is, we can, as long as we continue to upskill, we continue to understand things, we can offload the we will still be required in many cases to rerun the button study for an eighth time, a ninth time, right? But you can let the LLMs do that stuff, be handled in a way that's appropriate. But what we can do is focus on those things that are unique to each of the contextual things that are unique to each of our organizations. And I
Yeah.
think that's where I'm really excited. Like I said before, like, a lot of the research we do is table stakes, and just simply doing research and having, like, a defined UX discipline within your organization already puts you in the top percentile, right? So still a huge differentiator. Just look at the LLMs that come out. They're successful in spite of their usability, not because of it, right?
Yeah.
Right? These
Yeah.
like, a
Absolutely.
chatbot's just a chatbot. They've stunk forever. They still stink. It just brings so much value, right? So
Yes.
so that will be the differentiator in the future. Is like, just think about LLMs in general. Like, there are people doing groundbreaking work in the UX space right now to figure out the best way that humans interact with these chatbots in a way that's never really been dove into too much before. That's where the opportunity lies. So I think I'm super excited about that. I'm super excited about diving into the novel, the new, and finally being able to put our efforts towards the things that matter.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, I want to be mindful of your time, so I'll leave you with one last question. Is there anything else you would want to leave or share with my audience before we let you go?
Yeah. Well, again, I want to say thanks for having me. Secondly, I had no idea where this conversation was going to go. So it's kind of funny. I can't even remember what we talked about, just random kind of high level stuff. But I'm all about doing these things in the real world. So despite the fact that we talked high level, I just encourage people to actually do it, actually do the work. I'm biased in this way because I learned on the job. I learned by doing, and I've not found a better way of teaching. I just ran a seminar earlier today about a specific complex method, and the first half was explaining the concepts, and the second half was actually doing the method. And I'll tell you, I could, via Zoom, I could see people's faces glaze over during the first part, right? And it wasn't until the second part that I believe actual learning happened. So I just encourage everyone to go and start doing stuff, start looking into these things, make sure you have reputable sources. And if you do it for yourself, everything else will come from it. So, people reach out to me all the time about career hacks. And that's the number one career hack is, if you want to get good at user research, you should do a bunch of user research. It's pretty simple.
So I'm going to give them links to your LinkedIn page and
Sure.
to your blog. Is there anywhere else they should be following you?
No, I mean, that's pretty much what I do. I'm on LinkedIn. That's where once a week I'll publish an article, and then I'll put a little promo post on LinkedIn. But that's about it. I have a day job. I only started the blog because I wanted a place. I was pretty much tired of saying the same things over and over again. So I was
Mhm.
like, oh no, I can just refer people to this link. So here's my thoughts on personas. Here's my thoughts on mixed methods. Here's my thoughts on this specific method. Here's how to learn how to use R. Things like that. Um, So I've been doing it for over 2.5 years, once a week. I still haven't run out of things to rant and rave about, so I'll be doing that in perpetuity until I get over it. And it's been amazing to clarify my thoughts. That's why I
Mm,
do it. There's no such thing as trying to get clicks. Everything's free. There's no paywalls, and it really has been helpful. So to clarify my own ideas, like I talk about these systems, but then it wasn't until I wrote it down in long form that I kind of it helped to reinforce these things, and it helped me flesh out stuff in even further detail. So really, the blog is the place to go because I use LinkedIn simply as a place to say, "Hey, I wrote an article. Check it out." Um, I'm trying to lower my diet of social media just in general for my own mental health. so,
yeah, because
so
it is a lot. It's
yeah,
definitely a lot.
but yeah,
All right.
I'm
Well,
happy to
Trevor,
talk to people in the comments of my blog, or they can DM me in LinkedIn. I'd be happy to talk with anybody at any time about anything. So
awesome. Well, Trevor, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I love chatting with you. So I hope this is not our last time.
yeah, I again, thanks again. And if you ever want to reach out about any specific methods or anything like that, I am a bona fide dork about this stuff, and I'd love to dive deep. So,
All
thanks again,
right.
and thanks for all you're doing. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
See ya.